Now it's got that red dot, so it's going. Yeah, it's going. It's
Thank
good.
you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, if everybody can come in and take their seats.
I'm not in the middle of that anymore, but still it's good, interesting stuff.
Sorry, going against the flow of traffic here.
On your filming that, promoted, huh?
Standing right in front.
From doorman to
Film it.
maybe I'll get a raise.
I hope so.
I got my Warriors shirt on my car.
Oh, we'll see.
Tonight's the night.
Yeah, you kind of always knew where they were, but just not which valley, you know.
Okay, those of you out in the lobby, if you can come on in. Because this last talk's going to be really, really good. Chris, are you still in the room? Yeah, I'd like, why don't you stand up while everybody's gathering. This is Chris Bubser, and she's running for Congress. Yeah, she's running in our District 8 against Paul Cook. So please, Chris will say a few words over at the park later, and please know that she's here, and you can ask her questions when you want to. Okay. All right, so Kevin is last but not least. Kevin is a Pupfish researcher, and he's also a Mono Lake Committee employee this summer, so we're really excited to have him in Dining. And I first heard Kevin do a talk on Pupfish at the History Conference down at Snarl last fall, and I was just sitting there thinking, we have to get him for the climate seminar because it's such a wonderful story of resilience with the pupfish. So I'll let Kevin tell you the rest. Dr. Kevin Brown.
Thanks so much, David, for that really nice introduction, and thanks to all the other wonderful, really great talks this afternoon, and of course to all of you for sticking around, because it's a beautiful day out there. So today, what I'm going to do is really just a few things. First, I should say that, as Janet mentioned, I'm a historian by training, and I'm part of a subfield in the discipline of history called environmental history. And what we do is sit around and think and research and write about how human relationships with the natural world change throughout history over time. And we do this with the methods of historians. So we spend a lot of time in archives, at universities, at the federal government, in office buildings, in people's homes, and try and piece together a story of how people and their institutions have interacted with and shaped nature. This means, as a sort of aside, that we don't go places often with other people. We're like cats. We're on our own. But I dragged a friend out to Devil's Hole, which I'll be talking about last summer. So that's Brian, and I finally got a human in a photo of Devil's Hole after several years. Okay, you may be thinking to yourself with that introduction, okay, what is a historian going to tell me about climate change? This is a present problem, a future problem, and it is one that in public discussions and before Senate panels and so forth is often led by scientists. And I'm not a scientist. But I think that history is important, and I think that we can offer, and this story can offer at least a couple lessons for facing climate change in the Eastern Sierra, or better yet, in the Great Basin, because I won't actually be talking about the Sierra. So I'm going to do three things today. The first is I want to talk briefly about an isolated species of desert fish that lives in Death Valley National Park in Nye County, Nevada. And I want to talk about how climate change is threatening its future. This fish is I got to get out my clicker here. This fish is the subject of there it is. There's Devil's Hole pupfish. We'll come back to them. This fish is the subject of a lengthy report that I wrote for the National Park Service a few years ago, and it is also the subject of a book that I'm writing and I'm completing for the University of Nevada Press about how it is that this fish has managed to survive the 20th century. That's the focus of the book and what that means for the US West. But really today I'm just going to talk first about how it is this fish is threatened by climate change. The second thing I'm going to do is sort of back up and just briefly survey the sort of current state of biodiversity and our concern that we are at the outset of what some have called, over the last 20 years or so, the sixth mass extinction, in part fueled by climate change. And then finally what I'll do, and hopefully this is the takeaway, is return to the story of the pupfish as a species threatened by climate change and throw a wrench in that, or at least add an asterisk and say that for many species, including the pupfish, climate change is not the only game in town. I don't think this is a new argument, either for the pupfish or in the big picture, but I think it's important. And so the pupfish's history shows that the challenges it faces via global climate change, carbon emissions, are also due in large measure to long-standing but significantly less sexy and regionally influenced issues, especially water usage. Now, I said that this is less sexy, but I guess the Mono Basin is the place to tell a story about water. So, okay, let's start with the pupfish as influenced and by climate change. So where is the Devil's Hole pupfish? This is a species that lives in one tiny spot on the east side of Death Valley National Park. So you can see us right up here, Lee Vining. You go down through Big Pine and up and over and down 95. And about 5 hours later, you're going to end up in a place called Ash Meadows, which is in the Amargosa Desert. And sitting there, somewhat surprisingly, is a little 40-acre segment of Death Valley National Park. The Devil's Hole pupfish is the sole vertebrate resident of Devil's Hole, and the habitat, the 40 acres, was added to the then Death Valley National Monument in 1952. This tiny little fish is about an inch long. It's about the distance from the top of your thumb to your first knuckle, and there are not a lot of them. The population has declined since about 1995, and in 2006, 2007, and 2013, counts by the Park Service showed that there were fewer than 40 individuals in Devil's Hole. This means, as I've done this before, this means that the entire species could fit in this Nalgene bottle, which is a pretty amazing thing and makes it something of an extreme species. The habitat it lives in is no less extreme. It is basically, this is looking from this platform that the Park Service installed down into Devil's Hole about 45 feet before you see that black area is the water level, and that's about 10 feet across by about 60 feet long. And this makes it the most restricted vertebrate habitat in the world. The whole population lives in this spot, and the water in there, and this will become important, is basically a constant 92 degrees warm. When you're looking at Devil's Hole, you're looking into an aquifer. This is a rare vantage point. Divers from the USGS have dived as deep as 430 feet through this 10-foot by 60-foot opening and used it to tell a story actually about climate change. They removed calcite from the walls of Devil's Hole to do some paleoclimate dating. In any case, it's going to get just one more, it gets weirder. The southern end of Devil's Hole, this is a view from basically right outside the water. The southern end of Devil's Hole, despite the fact that it goes down so deep, the southern end is only between a few inches and a couple feet deep. There's a rock that's wedged in there, and it creates what the scientists call a shallow shelf. And every pupfish, Devil's Hole pupfish, in the world reproduces on that 14 meter squared area. Let's see. Okay, there are pupfishes elsewhere. If you're like, I thought I saw some pupfish somewhere else. It's okay, you did. There are in the Death Valley region, from the Owens Valley all the way to the south end of Death Valley. There are 10 species and subspecies of pupfish, and that's a term that's used to describe this particular genus of fish. So, okay. So I said that the pupfish are endangered by climate change. They are certainly threatened. And here is the basic problem. And now I'm just going to be borrowing from some research done by a hydrologist at the University of Nevada's Desert Research Institute named Mark Hausner. And for his dissertation research, he started to look into this, basically into this question of climate change and the pupfish. And he did so by looking at the water. Oh, sorry, one more photo here. This is the fence that the Park Service built around part of the Devil's Hole site. So if you actually go there, what you do is you walk through this kind of tunnel, and then you can look down into this crevice. This is the landscape around. This is actually a really lush part of the Amargosa Desert. There's Ash Meadows itself is kind of an island of biodiversity. There are somewhere around 30 endemic species that live only in this spot, and so fence. Two divers drowned. The Park Service put this up after 2 divers trespassed and drowned in Devil's Hole, and no sign of them or their equipment has ever been found. Something that both Ed Abbey and Joan Didion have managed to write about. Okay, other pupfishes. Sorry, I got behind on my slides. Okay, so this is Mark Hausner. And Mark Hausner's research as a PhD student and now at DRI, he started with this observation that the pupfish reproduce only on that very shallow shelf. He also observed that weather records show that the ambient air temperature in the Mojave Desert is rising. And he also noted that the water temperature in Devil's Hole is already at basically the thermal maximum. The highest temperature really is already reached where pupfish recruitment can be successful. In other words, at really high temperatures, it's very unlikely that an egg will hatch and become a successful adult pupfish. And so he started with those 3 observations, and then by using some very complicated modeling techniques, realized that the time for successful recruitment of pupfish under different climate scenarios is likely to decline pretty substantially, and in fact already has. So between 1980 and 1990, basically the idea is that there is 74 days where pupfish recruitment can be successful in any given year. And then if you go through these different scenarios, long-term, mid-term, and worst case, best case, it could be that by the end of this century, there are only 57 days of recruitment time for pupfish. I've left out a story about food availability, but let's just stick with this part of it. Basically, there is a more than 2-week reduction over the course of this century, likely in how many pupfish can be recruited. Now, these fish only live for 10 months to 14 months. So 2 weeks, it's not like you have a lot of time. So this needs to happen. You got to get these pupfish going. Got to get the recruitment to happen. But that's not what is likely to occur. And what amazes me. So here's sort of his conclusion from one of the papers he wrote about this. Although we cannot definitively show that climate change is responsible for the recent declines in pupfish population, the climate of the Mojave is driving conditions that will likely reduce the success of annual recruitment of young pupfish in the future. And what's amazing to me about that is how small the numbers seem. We've already only experienced a 1 degree Celsius rise in the air temperature, and that only affects the water temperature, maybe 1/10 of that at any given moment. And 2 weeks shorter doesn't seem like a huge chunk of time, but it is. And this is what climate change on biodiversity can look like at the really granular scale. The world of the pupfish is, to borrow a phrase, is both very big and very small. They're connected to this big process, but they live in only this one tiny place. The pupfish, as you might gather, and know about already, is not alone. Lots of other species are in trouble. Long before global climate change became important, we've witnessed an unusual number of extinctions, geologically speaking, just in the last 100 years, or 200 years or so. This is Audubon's painting of the great auk. It was a species of bird in the North Atlantic which has gone extinct. We're also even, we have the habit of naming the last of. And so this is Martha Washington. She is the last passenger pigeon, and I believe is on display now at the Smithsonian. Booming Ben was the name of the last heath hen, and lots of others don't get names, like the last Carolina parakeet, the last ivory-billed woodpecker, and so on. And these are not outliers. The thing that we know is that the extinctions are occurring at a much greater rate than we would expect. Scientists call this a background rate of extinction. We're moving faster than that. For fishes, like the now extinct Ash Meadows poolfish, which lived only a few miles from where the Devil's Hole pupfish lives, for freshwater fishes in North America, the modern extinction rate is already about 900 times greater than the background extinction rate. And the first species to be removed from the endangered species list by reason of extinction was a pupfish. So some scientists, as I mentioned, have called this the sixth extinction. The fifth extinction is the event and all the events that culminated or resulted from the asteroid that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and many other species. And so this to call it the sixth extinction is rather provocative. It's sort of meant to provoke us, I think, to think about what is it that our own impact may be in the geologic record on species diversity. Elizabeth Colbert's book is probably the most recent version of this, where she traces scientists whose job has turned into following extinctions around. Now, okay, one more tiny, well, it's kind of big, but it's one more bummer, and then we'll back off, okay? So if you've been following these kinds of issues, a UN panel just a few weeks ago released a summary of their conclusions, and I put up this whole quote here, but basically, even for global warming of just 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, synthesis studies suggested the fraction of species at risk for climate-related extinctions is 5%, rising to 16% for more higher levels of warming. So for endemics like the Devil's Hole pupfish that live in this one tiny little spot, this is pretty serious business, and they're not alone. Okay, so now you're still wondering, wait, I thought you said you were a historian. Well, we're going to turn back to the Devil's Hole pupfish in that asterisk. So I said the Devil's Hole pupfish is threatened by climate change. That is absolutely true. But we can use history to tell us that there's more to the story, and maybe that there's more that we can do here. And I mean history not just of carbon emissions, but a sort of a broader sense of history. In the late 1960s, a rancher began pumping groundwater in and around Ash Meadows in order to feed a large cattle operation and grow feed for cattle, including drilling a well and installing a pump just 900 feet from Devil's Hole on the boundary of the Death Valley National Monument property. This is another view, more trouble brewing. His initial consulting hydrologist report acknowledged that the water level in Devil's Hole would drop. And it's easy to paint this person as a villain. In the same way that we often look at oil companies or other large industrial firms in the context of climate change now. But I want to suggest that this rancher is not the person to point to. Public agencies allowed this to happen because their interpretation of how natural resources should be used was very different from one that we hold today. So the Bureau of Land Management thought that the highest and best use of this land was to sell it or to trade it with this rancher. They didn't have to think at all about the ecology of this place. And the Nevada Division of Water Resources decided that the beneficial use of this water should go to ranching, and it should not include the existence of pupfish. Some people, however, disagreed with those judgments. So the water level in Devil's Hole plummeted like a rock. So this is the distance from a reference marker that's kind of arbitrarily put above Devil's Hole. But you can see that over the course of about 2 years, it dropped more than 2 feet. So really even exposed parts of that shallow shelf that the pupfish depend on. The water level recorder that the USGS installed actually went dry, so they had to reinstall it. And the Park Service and many very dedicated field employees said that this is not right, and I don't care what the law says about beneficial use. We need to find a way to save these fish. Eventually, there were some Save the Pupfish bumper stickers floating around California about 10 years before the Mono Lake ones appeared. The Interior Department got enough letters and enough bad press that they created a task force, which is that's a good first step. But eventually, and I'm moving pretty quick here, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards or so forth, this case went to the Supreme Court. And this is the Supreme Court the following year. The case was there in 1976, but this is in 77 with Jimmy Carter. And in case you were wondering, what would it take for Jimmy Carter to look cool, you have to surround him with 9 Supreme Court justices. That's just a side thought. The only living, so John Paul Stevens on here on the right is actually still alive. He's retired from the court, but still alive, and he participated in a decision that basically affirmed that the federal government, when it had set aside those 40 acres to preserve pupfish in 1952, had also reserved enough water in order to accomplish that purpose. Okay, but over the following decades, so the rancher was unable to continue pumping that groundwater. There's some other administrative decisions in Nevada that further enhance those protections, and basically the water level recovers to a pretty reasonable extent, but it never again reaches that pre-pumping level. It's still about 20 centimeters, give or take, lower than that first letter, or first level. Let's see. So to go back to our chart of the likely future of pumping, or sorry, likely future of days that it's suitable for pupfish recruitment, which is likely to decline. Mark Hausner, he went back, he did this report, and then he's like, well, what if I run the model again and I change it so the water level is 20 centimeters higher? What if we go back and try and see what it would be like for the pupfish in the future of climate change if the water level was at that pre-pumping level? Well, he found that if the water level could be returned to pre-pumping level, which would require reductions in groundwater pumping, the mid-range, middle of this century, and long-range windows, even under the extreme warming scenarios, are 81 and 75 days, both of which are longer than the duration between 1980 and 1990 when the pupfish population was relatively stable. Now, there are a lot of reasons why that phrase, which would require reductions in groundwater pumping, make that really hard. But I would like to close really with just two observations or 2 lessons from this story. And let me just say this again. Basically, the impact of this water level is orders of magnitude more important than a slight increase in the air, 2-degree increase in the ambient air temperature in the Mojave Desert. So it's this lowering of the water level plus climate change that endangers the pupfish into the end of this century. So why is this important? Well, I'm going to start with the first reason that is rooted in my background in history and in journalism, and I think is also shared by scientists. This is an honest accounting. We have to bear witness to each part of this story so that we know where these things came from. And there's really no other reason than to be able to look it squarely in the eye and know that how we have used water and how our institutions have worked and the values that underlie them have both imperiled species and resulted in some modest conservation victories that have let the pupfish get this far. I think additionally, this offers us a path. Oh, so that's for greater knowledge on more subjects. That's what I want to hear. That's from the WPA. But so the second thing is a path for action. That's a Ridley sea turtle. which is certainly also endangered by climate change, but also by fishing gear. There are a lot of seemingly mundane or routine decisions taking place every day that have long-run consequences for biodiversity and ourselves. And especially given how far down the road we are in altering the parts per million of carbon dioxide. These regional and local decisions will play an even larger role in what survives and what does not. That UN panel that I mentioned that said that 5 to 16% of all species are imperiled as a result of climate change, they would also agree with me. In their conceptualization of the biodiversity crisis, they found that in terms of components to extinction risk for species, the following are as or more important than climate change. Land and sea use changes, direct exploitation, overhunting, overharvesting, pollution, and invasive species. So there are many other parts of each of these stories. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your time.
Questions for Kevin?
Oh, here's my questions slide. This is much love to the Park Service. They employed me, but when you come on one of these, it's a bummer. Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you know what the name of that court case where they decided on the...
Yeah. So the case is called Capert versus U.S. And the origins of the case, so that's Cappaert. And the origins of the case, or the logic of the case, is actually rooted in federal reserved rights for Indian reservations. There's an important case about in the early 20th century that basically said when the federal government set aside Indian reservations as part of this long process of appropriating land from Native Americans, that when they created these reservations, they also had reserved enough water to accomplish the purpose of allowing Native Americans to grow crops on that land. And over time, that circle of which things the federal government could theoretically reserve water for has grown. This hasn't been tested, but surely the Forest Service here could say that they have a federal reserved water right in the Mono Basin, although it would be very junior to lots of other rights. So it's kind of a different legal story. Yeah.
So you're talking about the divers going to the devil's...
I know, right? Oh, sorry, yeah.
Does that have any effect on the pupfish who are living there when the divers...
Yeah, so in 1965, these 4 young men, I think they were all under the age of 20, snuck in, went diving. 2 of them did not surface, and then over the following several days, a massive search and rescue operation was undertaken with Navy divers and all that kind of thing. It's obviously a heartbreaking story and tragic in a lot of ways. It surely did affect the pupfish in some way, but it's unknowable, essentially, because the Park Service acts with, and especially in this period in the 60s, with really good intentions, but they also have a really short memory, and at the time, they weren't that interested in this resource that they had just acquired. So they weren't doing any monitoring, except for measuring the water level. So that no one really knows. They do dive now in Devil's Hole to count the population. So the Park Service divers will tell you that the pupfish don't seem to mind too much, I think. The cover of High Country News a couple months ago, though, was about another trespass case there, just from last year, or 2016.
What is the population?
Yeah, so the other thing I skipped over some of the details. The population booms in the fall and busts over the winter and into the spring. So the fall population is always bigger. And so last fall it was like 182, which is the highest that had been recorded in like 10 years, I think. There are fewer pupfish in the world than there are California condors. Is another way to look at that. There's a lot of bird people here, so. Yes?
Are there any predators that eat pupfish?
Oh, that's such a great question. So it's one of the biologists who worked on the pupfish for a long time named Jim Deacon. He worked at UNLV. I asked him, like, well, why does this matter? Like, what's the big deal? Like, this is in an interview. And he's like, well, if we can't figure out how this tiny ecosystem works, how can we expect to fix anything bigger? And one of the questions is about whether the pupfish have predators. So they're the only vertebrate in the system, but there is some evidence that there's a predaceous diving beetle that dives on or eats pupfish eggs. And so maybe that's another reason that their population has declined. There's basically three ways to think of like, well, why is the pupfish population low? I told you the one story, this is climate story. There's a second story that's about genetics, and it says, man, these pupfish are all kissing cousins, and eventually this is going to go bad. And then the third story is the ecology, is like, did something in the interaction in the ecosystem change? Is there something new, something not there that was there? And a lot of these questions are really hard to sort out. Even in a place that you would think, like, we could get a grasp on this, you know? Yeah?
What do they eat?
So the pupfish eat pretty much anything. They do eat algae and also other little invertebrates, basically. Yeah. Yeah?
What year did they start monitoring or counting?
Yeah, so this is maybe another lesson that's more specifically for land managers and people like, you aren't going to know what happens unless you start monitoring it. And this is, like in the report that I wrote for the Park Service, this was probably the central insight, was like, you can't stop monitoring. Like this is forever. So the first study of the ecosystem was done by a graduate student in 1969. And that report is still cited because there's so little information about Devil's Hole prior to the water level declining. All the first scientists that showed up at Devil's Hole were taxonomists. And what that means is they were really interested in taking fish out of the hole, putting them in alcohol, and then looking at them under a microscope in their lab to decide what they were, which is really important. That's an important kind of work. What's a species? How does evolution work? But it actually has limited value in terms of understanding life history and all the kinds of things you'd want to know if you know an ecosystem is changing over time. Yes?
Bill Keister's story about saving species in a bucket.
The species in a bucket.
Is that a different location?
Yeah. So the question is about, there's now a retired Cal Fish and Game biologist in Bishop by the name of Phil Keister, who in 1969, actually just really months before the movement to save the Devil's Hole pupfish got going, he was in the Owens Valley, and he had the entire population of Owens pupfish, a related species, in 2 buckets. And he carried them from a place where the water was drying up, and he moved them to another place. So there's an article he wrote in 1993 that is called "Species in a Bucket," and if you can find it, it's totally worth reading because it is this story of him being like, I can't trip. It's pretty serious.
Oh no.
If there are other questions, I'll be in the bookstore all weekend too, so if it isn't too busy, you can find me there.
We can't wait to read Kevin's book, right? So what I'd like to do now is have all of our speakers come up. Jeff and Connie and Deanna and who am I missing? Ellery. We should have 6. Who am I forgetting? Regine, where are you? Is Regine in the house? She's out with the Teslas.
No, she's right out front.
Okay, have Regine come in.
She's still there?
So this is one of our little traditions at the seminar is, we've heard a lot of things today, we've absorbed a lot of information, and I think kind of the bottom line is, well, okay, what are we going to, when we walk out the doors, what are we going to take with us, and how are we going to be inspired by this to take action? So the question I'd like to ask all the speakers is, what message would you like everyone to take home? And this is a pretty exciting time in the climate world right now, with the Green New Deal floating out there, the legislation the students mentioned for the carbon fee and dividend, and it seems like we are maybe possibly approaching the tipping point. No? Maybe? Yes, no, maybe so? We're making progress. So anyway, just your final thoughts and what you'd like everybody to take out the door.
my short thought would be that I listen to the national news in the morning and it's really depressing about climate matters and stepping away from treaties and undermining science, and listen to the kind of work people are doing and what kids are doing and what's possible in the middle streams, and there's really a lot that can be done, and so we got to go do it, because this really is the time. It's really urgent. We should do it now.
This is the hardest part. When Janet emailed us this question, I was like, oh man, I don't know. But I think I'll actually just emphasize what I close with, which is that there's a climate story in basically every action that we take or don't take. And so when you look at a groundwater basin and how it's being used, that's one kind of story that needs to be looked at by people who care about climate change. It also is true with whether we decide to build a road or not, or public transit. I mean, there are a million places where climate can come into play, and I think that the difficulty but also the possibility is in using climate as a lens on all sorts of public policy, not just on thinking about the parts per million. Yeah.
Well, I thought I would take a hint from what Janet was focusing on with transportation. And so she's got us thinking about low carbon emission cars. And I wanted to tell a story about air travel. And so I told you about this research proposal that we're doing with Gloria and the fellow over in Austria, Harry Pauli, and his group. So the funding agency that we submitted our proposal to, it basically funds workshops for scientists to come together face to face. It's a big deal. You get together and you come back for another week later. And Hari and his crew made it very clear when they were contributing to our proposal that they would not come. They would not fly from Europe to Colorado. This is in Fort Collins. And yes, we're 9 hours different, but we will do it remotely in the middle of the night if you're going to have your workshops during the middle of the day here. And so that really impressed me a lot, that commitment. And he said, even if I wanted to come, my children wouldn't let me fly, because they're so tuned in, like these guys, and they're influencing us, the old guys. So that was a neat story. And then maybe a month later or so, I was reading Climate Science magazine, and there's a new initiative among North American scientists called No Fly Sci. And I'm going to send the PDF to Janet so she can send it around.